Didn't anybody ever tell you that I'm a unfrocked priest? It's God.
Get out, you fool! I'm going to get drunk.
Welcome to today's show. My name is John. As always, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes, or follow the links to social media in the podcast show notes. So please subscribe when you're finished listening. You can also go to classicmovierev.com to read notes, bios, and other random movie thoughts. Today's movie is The Razor's Edge, 1946. It's a great movie and is based on a novel by English writer W. Somerset Maugham. IMDb.com rates this movie as 7.5, while on RottenTomatoes.com it is at 83% on the tomato meter. At the time of release, some critics thought that Tyrone Power as Larry Darrell came across too preachy. I can see why they would feel that way. Power is a great actor, but he may have been too much of a leading man to pull off the bohemian role. In the remake, The Razor's Edge, 1984, Bill Murray was perfect as the searcher, but everyone, except me, hated that movie. Anne Baxter won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for the role of Sophie. She certainly deserves the Oscar. Of all the characters in the film, she goes through the greatest transition and is amazingly believable. There are a number of returning actors, so let's jump right in. Actors.
Right, and I'm a Shakespearean actor.
Jean Tierney played the spoiled, scheming child of wealth, Isabel Bradley. Jean Tierney was first covered in episode 91, Laura, 1944. John Payne played the honest stockbroker, Gray Matron. Payne was covered in episode 38, 99 River Street, 1953. Clifton Webb played the eccentric and wealthy socialite, Elliot Templeton, and he was great. Webb was covered in episode 91, Laura, 1944. Elsa Lanchester had a relatively small but important role as Miss Keith, personal secretary to Princess Nova Molly. Lancaster was covered way back in episode 7, Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. Anne Baxter played the self-destructive Sophie MacDonald. Baxter was just covered in episode 115, The Blue Gardenia, 1953. Tyrone Power played the role of a man seeking understanding, Larry Darrell. Power was born in Ohio in 1914. His parents, both actors, moved the family to California. Following a divorce, Tyrone and his sister moved to Cincinnati with their mother. It was during this time that Tyrone first became interested in acting. While working with his father in a play in Chicago, Tyrone witnessed his father die of a heart attack. Tyrone had a hard time finding work in Hollywood, landing only a few small roles. Finally, he headed east to do some stage work. In 1936, Tyrone had a screen test with 20th Century Fox and was signed to a contract. It only took about a year before the devilishly handsome actor became a star. Tyrone starred in a lot of sword and tights movies like Marie Antoinette, 1938, The Mark of Zorro, 1940, and The Black Swan, 1942. His film noir roles include Johnny Apollo, 1940, and Nightmare Alley, 1947. His best military movie was Crash Dive, 1943, released while he was still in the military. Drama and westerns include In Old Chicago, 1937, Alexander's Ragtime Band, 1938, Jesse James, 1939, Brigham Young, 1940, Blood and Sand, 1941, The Black Rose, 1950, Rawhide, 1951, Pony Soldier, 1952, King of the Khyber Rifles, 1953, and The Mississippi Gambler, 1953. He really got down to serious acting with The Razor's Edge, 1946, The Long Gray Line, 1955, The Sun Also Rises, 1957, and Witness for the Prosecution, 1957. While making all of these films, he managed to find time to serve in the Marine Corps piloting a transport plane during World War II. In 1958, while filming Solomon and Sheba, 1959, Tyrone died of a heart attack. He was 44 years old. Herbert Marshall played the author of the story, W. Somerset Maugham. Marshall trained to be an accountant, but soon became interested in stagecraft. While serving in World War I, Marshall lost a leg, and he was taught to walk on a wooden leg. He used a very square stance on stage, and with only a slight limp, most people didn't notice. He worked on stage for almost 20 years before making his film debut in 1927 in a silent film. Near the age of 40, he made his first Hollywood movie, The Letter, 1929, with Bette Davis. Marshall's heydays were in the 1930s. His best-known comic role was in Trouble in Paradise, 1932, and his most romantic role was in Blonde Venus, 1932, with Marlene Dietrich. In the Alfred Hitchcock-directed Foreign Correspondent, 1940, Marshall played a peace leader secretly working for the other side. He was cold-blooded in Duel in the Sun, 1946. Later, he and his rich voice became associated with sci-fi films like Riders to the Star, 1954, Gog, 1954, and The Fly, 1958. When Marshall died in 1966, he had over 90 acting credits in film and television. Story.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
The movie begins with W. Somerset Maugham, Herbert Marshall, narrating a dinner engagement. The Great War, World War I, is over, and America believes the years ahead are going to be wonderful. The year is 1919, and Maugham is meeting with social snob Elliot Templeton, Clifton Webb, and his sister, Louisa Bradley, Lucy Watson. Money doesn't seem to be an issue for the crowd assembled at the club. Elliot complains about Prohibition and says Maugham is a famous writer.
Here you are.
With a dry martini, sir.
Prohibition of all the bloody nonsense.
Elliot,
Yes, dear.
who is this man that you asked to dinner tonight? I had to get Sophie at the last minute or we would have been 13.
He's an English author. He's quite all right. In fact, he's really quite famous. So pretend that you've heard of him, even if you haven't.
That's too much. Get the other glasses. Elliot, you must be slipping if you frequent authors.
Not at all, my dear. Authors go everywhere nowadays. Why, in London, I even met actors and actresses in society.
Elliot also complains that his niece is marrying below her station. His niece is Isabel Bradley, Jean Tierney. Before they can get through the introduction, her friend, the scintillating but less wealthy Sophie MacDonald, Anne Baxter, arrives. Sophie mentions that she is engaged to Bob MacDonald, Frank Lattimore. Just then, Isabel's second-place boyfriend, the very rich gray matron, John Payne, arrives. Sophie won't take a drink because Bob says she is too fond of the grape. Finally, Larry Darrell, Tyrone Power, Sophie's fiancé, shows up. Maugham says Larry is the subject of the book and is very special. Isabel tells Maugham that Larry was a pilot in the war, and later they find that Larry has turned down a job working for Gray's dad. Maugham mentions that he saw Larry reading in the library. At last, Bob shows up and whisks Sophie away. Finally, Isabel gets Larry away from the crowd and quizzes him about not taking the stock market job. Larry says he wants to loaf, and Isabel is upset. She tries to sell him on working for the good of America. It seems like Larry may have PTSD. He tells about a friend of his that died in the war while saving his life. The pair decide that Larry should go away for a while and that Isabel will wait. Larry says he will travel to Paris. When Isabel gets home that night, Elliot is reading the riot act to Louisa about Isabel wanting to marry Larry. Elliot lays out a plan for Larry's trip. Of course, Larry works his way across on a cargo boat, hanging with the lower class. Larry moves into a small flat in the Latin Quarter of Paris. He buys books and lives life to the fullest. After about a year, Larry gets a note that Isabel is coming to Paris. Elliot is shocked that Larry has shown up. He also says Larry has spurned all of his invitations. Isabel spends a month in Paris and she tries to pin Larry down. Finally, he takes her back to his place, complete with crying babies and lower-class folks. She turns her nose up at the place. Larry wants Isabel to marry him, and they can live off his $3,000 annual inheritance. That should be around $36,000 now. Isabel says she wants to have babies, and Larry quips that they can go along on the travel.
I love you and I want you to marry me.
When, in 10 years?
No, now, as soon as possible.
On what?
I've got $3,000 a year.
Oh, Larry.
Well, lots of people live on a great deal less.
But I don't want to live on $3,000 a year. I never have, and I don't see why I should.
We could go down to Capri for our honeymoon, and then in the fall we could go to Greece. Remember how we used to talk about traveling all over the world together?
Of course I want to travel. But not like that. Cheap restaurants, third-rate hotels. Besides, I want to have babies, Larry.
All right, darling, we'll take them along with us.
Oh, Larry, you're so impractical. You don't know what you're asking me to do. I'm young. I want to have fun. Do all the things people do.
Larry goes on saying he is looking for answers. It reminds me of a Jimmy Buffett song. He went to Paris looking for answers to questions that bothered him so. Isabel gives back the engagement ring, and Larry begs her to wear it on another finger so the two can remain friends. Isabel and Louisa stay at Elliot's house in Paris for another month. On the last night, Isabel goes out on a date with Larry. Isabel is rocking a black evening gown with 2 spaghetti straps. They go in for some Moulin Rouge-style entertainment and another restaurant with Russian folk singers. Yul Brynner did this work when he was young. Then they head to a swinging jazz club. Larry innocently goes along while the sullen Isabel works her plan. She pulls him in at the goodbye for one last drink. They get their kissy face on with epic music swelling in the background. But Isabel puts the "you better go" on Larry. He leaves quietly as Isabel whispers, "Larry." Elliot has been listening in and compliments Isabel on her performance. Elliot says Isabel was running the baby trap, but she says she couldn't go through with it because of how innocent Larry looked.
That was a brilliant performance, my dear. I left the door just a little open. Shall I get you a drink? I expect you want it.
You think you're very clever, don't you?
I don't think it, I know it. Come, child, be reasonable. I guessed you were up to something. Even your poor mother noticed the pains you went to make yourself alluring tonight.
You're hateful.
But no fool, my angel. Am I right in surmising that you thought if you could get him to come back here, it was almost inevitable that the inevitable should happen?
No one could put it more delicately.
The next scene is back in Chicago at the wedding of Isabel and Gray. Maughan is there, and Elliot gets snotty with the poor gift Sophie and Bob gave. Sophie and Bob already have a child. Maughan asks about Larry and says he's been looking for him in Paris. Larry is working as a miner in Linz. This mine was probably located in Pas-de-Calais, where the stupid Nazis thought D-Day was coming. It is also near the site of the largest European mining disaster, where in 1906 almost 1,100 miners were killed. After work one rainy day, Larry goes to a cafe where he meets with a veteran miner, Costi, Franz Kortner. Costi quizzes him about the questions and why people have been asking the same questions for thousands of years. He recommends that Larry go to India. Costi says he went there and met a man that helped people. Costi says he is fleeing from someone that wants to give him mercy. He says he is a defrocked priest and is really running from God.
But what about the answers to all those profound questions you have been asking yourself? Don't you know people have been asking the same questions for thousands of years? You sound like a very religious man who doesn't believe in God. Have you ever thought of going to the East?
No.
India, for instance? I went there. I met a strange man. A man I never thought to meet in this world. A saint.
Did he help you?
No. But that wasn't his fault. It was mine.
How did you ever come to go to India?
To escape my pursuer, he followed me there. I wallowed in the gutters of half the seaports of Europe to put him off my track. He was waiting for me. I know, however far I flee, one day he will come up with me and I shall feel the terrible hand on my shoulder. It's mercy, forgiveness, love. Didn't anybody ever tell you that I'm a unfrocked priest? It's God.
Get out, you fool. I'm going to get drunk.
Larry makes his way to a temple in India that looks like it may be Shangri-La. He meets with the Hindu leader, Hassan Khayyam, and is allowed to stay for a while. The Hindu priest tells Larry the sharp edge of a razor is difficult to pass over. Thus the wise say the path to salvation is hard, which is a verse from the Hindu Kath Upanishad. Back in Chicago, Bob and Sophie are in a car crash that kills Bob and the baby. Gray has to come in and deliver the news. As expected, Sophie doesn't take the news well. They start hitting her up with opiates right away. Gray and Isabel pull away from their friend right at the time she needs them most. Back in India, Larry is ready to go on his pilgrimage to the mountains. He is told there is a shelter at the top of the mountain that he can stay in. After a long time, the Hindu leader comes to see Larry. Something has happened to Larry. He is changed by what he has seen in nature. The leader says Larry was one with God. He then sends Larry back to the world. Larry returns to Paris, and one day while Elliot is out shopping, he runs into Mon. Elliot has moved to the Riviera. Elliot tells Mon that he is descended from royalty. He also tells Mon that Gray was wiped out in the 1929 stock market crash, and he, Isabel, and the two kids are living at his apartment in Paris. He also says Gray had a breakdown and suffers from severe headaches. Mon takes Elliot to lunch, where unbeknownst to Elliot, they are meeting with Larry. Elliot also mentioned that his Vatican friends warned him about the coming crash in September, so he still has all of his money. When Elliot sees Larry, he quickly leaves. Mon tells the story of Isabel and Gray. Larry talks of learning about himself in India. Later, Mon goes to see Isabel and Gray. Isabel almost drops her face on the floor when she hears Larry is in town. A bit later, Larry shows up, and Isabel is still in love with him. Larry goes to see Gray, and he is really suffering from migraines. Gray says he can't go out to dinner with Mon. Larry uses an old coin and self-hypnosis to cure Gray. The four head out to dinner. Isabel confesses to Mon that she has only really ever loved Larry. They head to a lower-class joint. Suddenly, a drunken Sophie comes down the stairs. The people in the bar send her to see the Americans. Everyone sees the destroyed Sophie except Larry, who only sees his old friend.
Well, well, look who's here. Sophie. Who should think it was? Hello, Larry.
Hi, Brown Eyes. How are you?
Thirsty. Come on, let's all have a drink. Patron!
Connaissez messieurs dames, Sophie?
Do I know them? They're my childhood friends.
Donnez-nous une bouteille de champagne.
T'es encore saoul, hein, ma pauvre Sophie?
That girl who says I'm drunk. I can't say you seem so terribly pleased to see me.
I heard you were in Paris, Sophie.
You might have called me. I'm in the phone book.
Are you?
Yes.
Having a good time over here, Sophie?
Fine. You went bust, didn't you, Gray? I guess it must be pretty grim in Chicago right now. Lucky for me, I got out when I did. Where are those drinks? I'm in les flancs de courge.
Coco, Sophie's boyfriend/pimp, tries to get rough with Sophie, and Gray handles him well. Sophie leaves, and it is very awkward for the group. They tell Larry about Bob and the baby being killed. Isabel has nothing good to say about Sophie. Larry leaves the car and heads away. Isabel and Gray leave town for a month. Isabel calls Larry when she gets back. Larry says he has been seeing a lot of Sophie and they are going to be married. Isabel gets all pissy. Isabel sees Mon and complains about Larry and Sophie getting married. She asks Mon to talk Larry out of it, but Mon refuses. Isabel claims to be noble. She eventually tries to throw him out, and then he starts commenting on her physical appearance. It's a little strange. Finally, Mon says Larry is trying to save the soul of Sophie and that Isabel should be kind to Sophie. The next day, Larry brings Sophie to lunch with Isabel, Mon, and Gray. Elliot has a little spat with Princess Nova Molly, an American acting as a royal in Europe. Sophie suffers through everyone drinking around her. Elliot is sick and shouldn't be drinking. The waiter offers him Przovska, or peppered vodka, which is infused with red chili pepper. He makes a big production of drinking it in front of Sophie and tries to get her to take a drink. Isabel digs in, also trying to break Sophie. Isabel makes an arrangement to buy Sophie a wedding dress the next day. The next day, Isabel keeps Sophie waiting. Isabel starts grilling Sophie about not making Larry unhappy. Isabel takes a drink of Przovska. Sophie confesses how hard it is not to drink. Isabel goes to pick up her kid from the dentist and leaves Sophie with the bottle after reminding her of her own dead child. Isabel comes back and has the butler remove all of the booze except the Przovska. Alone, Sophie drinks while the music from her club plays in the background. Larry goes to Sophie's club and looks for her. He keeps coming back, but the locals are no help. Finally, a local takes him to an opium den with an Arabian bent. Sophie is asleep on the couch by a man wearing a fez. Larry tries to take her home, but she refuses. The fez guy burns Larry on the back of his neck with a cigar, and Larry reaches up and rips out his golden earring. They beat the crap out of Larry and throw him outside. Sophie runs out ahead of the tossing. About a year has passed since Sophie fell off the wagon. Mon is at the Riviera working on a book. The French police call in Mon to tell him that Sophie has been murdered by having her throat cut. A little later, Larry is brought in. The police take the two men to the place where Sophie lived. Not as bad a place as some I've had. Mon tells Larry that Elliot has fallen ill again. They head to Elliot's house. Larry flatters the dying Elliot. Elliot mentions that he has not been invited to Princess Nova Molly's party. Elliot says he helped her to get where she is, and there is no payback. Larry is getting ready to leave when Gray and Isabel arrive. Larry goes to Princess Nova Molly's house. He climbs in a window and is surprised by the secretary, Mrs. Keith, Elsa Lanchester. She and Larry are old friends, and she tells him that the princess crossed Elliot off the invitation list herself. Larry charms her into letting him take an invitation for Elliot. Back at Elliot's house, the priest gives the last rites. Gray, Isabel, and Mon go to visit Elliot. The butler comes in with a letter for Elliot. It is the invitation to the party that Larry stole. It makes Elliot very happy as he writes out a letter declining the invitation because of an appointment with his lord. He calls her an old witch, then dies. Isabel finds out Larry is leaving for Paris and almost blows a gasket. Mon says Larry is going back to America. Now that Isabel is rich, she says she will be seeing a lot of Larry in America. Isabel makes her play for Larry. Larry says he may buy a taxi, but Isabel tries to get him to join the company Gray is planning on opening with the money Isabel inherited from Elliot. Larry talks about the man that gave up his life for him during the war and his second chance. He also says Gray has a second chance, but Isabel is only concerned with herself and what she has given up for Larry. Larry then asks Isabel how she got Sophie down and how she got her drinking again. At last, Isabel admits what she did. Larry drops the bomb on Isabel that Sophie has been murdered.
I love you. Promise you'll come back with us. Promise you will.
Tell me about Sophie, Isabel.
All right, if you want the truth, you can have it. I did it, and I'd do it again. I was determined to stop at nothing to prevent her marrying you. Nobody else would do a thing. They didn't care. I did. Oh, Larry, you men are such fools. I knew that sooner or later she'd break down. It stuck out a mile.
Sophie's dead.
Dead?
Her body was found in the harbor at Toulon. She'd been murdered.
Oh, how horrible. Do they know who did it?
No. But I do.
Larry says he knows who murdered Sophie and stares into Isabella's eyes. Larry leaves Isabella staring after him. When Mon comes in, Isabel admits that she has lost Larry forever. Mon says Larry makes everyone better for being around because of his goodness. Larry is shown working on a boat as he returns to America. Notes: someone saved Larry's life and he could never pay them back. He went around doing good for people, like when he tried to save Sophie. His greatest act was getting the party invitation for Elliot. Elliot never liked Larry, and yet Larry did something to help him. It was a small task, but it brought great joy. Also, Larry could never expect anything back from Elliot. World-famous short summary: veteran goes on an extended vacay. Hope you enjoyed today's show. I really appreciate you spending the time listening. You can find connections to social media and email on my site at classicmovierev.com. There are links in the podcast show notes as well. Remember, the show is completely free and independent. All that I ask is that you jump over to Apple Podcasts and give me a review. It really helps the show get found. Beware the Moors.